So we're going to start with our first presenter, Dennis, who is going to speak about a very timely topic, Artemis, and he's got some interesting Apollo information to compare as well. So over to you, Dennis, if you don't mind
Okay.
sharing your screen. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. You may not see the whole thing here. We were trying to monkey around with the optics here, but thank you everybody for attending tonight. It's a bit unusual going back to Zoom. It harkens back to the COVID era, which we all want to forget. But at least we have this technology we can lean back on, which is great. So I'm going to talk tonight. This was supposed to be a presentation that was to be delivered a few weeks ago, but it's timely and it's something that's been in the news quite a bit lately. With a bit of a different twist, I thought it would be interesting to compare Artemis with the Apollo program, and there's some similarities, but also a lot of contrasting elements to it. But I thought it'd be interesting to compare the two and provide some information as well. The only challenge I had with this particular presentation was that I was having to edit it every single day because things were changing so rapidly and so fast. And if you've been online at all, there's been a lot of changes and updates. So I'll try to cover some of those, but I may have missed some along the way. And I look forward to your questions afterwards. So during this presentation, I'm going to cover off four key areas. The purpose, why we're doing these missions, the mission itself, some of the technology, more or less the propulsion technology that's used in both the Artemis and the Apollo missions, and also some of the lunar landers, and some details on the future missions, although that's a little bit still speculative a bit and is a moving target, but we'll cover off the future missions, particularly with regards to Artemis. So why did we, venture into space? With the American space program, if you all recall, some of you, the Mercury, Gemini, Apollo era from the 60s through the early 70s, and quite a lot happened in a 10-year period or 12-year period there. Um, we're going to be focusing on this presentation primarily on Artemis 2, that mission, which is going around the moon, and that compares favorably to Apollo 8. So we'll try to detail a little bit more about Apollo 8 here. The lunar landing, of course, was Apollo 11 back in '69, and Apollo 8 was around Christmas time of 1967. So back then, the motivation primarily was to beat the Russians to the moon. I mean, there was a huge political pressure to galvanize industry and government resources around this program, probably equal to the Manhattan Project when they were developing the atomic bomb, if not more than that. So a lot of effort went in. At some point, there was over 400,000 employees as part of the space program in that period of time. So it was massive. There was other benefits that came out of that and motivation to go there, advancement of technology. And there's a lot of technology today that came out of the Apollo program, including integrated circuit technology and various computer technologies, plastics, all kinds of advancements in technology were due to the space program. As you recall, back then in the 60s, the Vietnam War was a big deal, and we needed, or the United States looked to this program as well as an off-ramp for to project more positive agenda versus a negative agenda of the war. And in 1966 through to 69, I think they were very effective in doing that. It kind of saved the nation per se. And again, with respect to comparing themselves to the Soviets and trying to beat the Soviets to the moon, they demonstrated and affirmed the U.S. capabilities and abilities to the world. So basically, given the notion that they were going to spend their energies and focus on space travel, which was of interest to the community abroad. Artemis mission is different. It's out of the gate, it's intended to be a multinational cooperation, which is something that's been going on for a number of years in the space program, in the manned space program. So building off of that, and then a catalyst for community engagement. So you have companies like SpaceX, Blue Origin, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and many more that are contributing to this program, which is good. We need to engage the commercial community here. It can't just be all done by government means. The American space program of the 60s and 70s were primarily driven by a government program. Yes, they used a lot of commercial companies to develop things, but they were all kind of brought in-house to a certain degree. So we're depending a lot more on commercial technologies here off the shelf, so to speak. The other thing too is that we want to establish or an attempt to establish a permanent base on the moon. And this is going to be important to realize a number of objectives, certainly with looking at the resources on the lunar surface, water, and critical minerals, the ability to process fuel on the moon as a launch pad to future missions, perhaps to Mars. That's something that's been certainly talked about. Don't know how realistic it is, but that's part of the whole the mission sequence as we go forward with this Artemis program. And then, of course, from a political perspective, although I think it's more secondary in this project than it was in the American space program of the 60s and 70s, and that's to try to beat China to the moon. But again, I don't think that's front and center with regards to the motivations here. So it's a busy chart, but this is essentially the mission plan, flight path for Artemis 2. Um, it almost looks a little bit like the Apollo 8 program, but with a few big differences. One of the things that Artemis 2 is trying to demonstrate here is the ability to do a number of shakedown tests with regards to the rocket, the propulsion systems, the Orion spacecraft itself. So there's going to be a near elliptical orbit that takes place with Artemis 2. I think there at some point if you look at number 8 there, there's a number of, well, through the sequence, there's a number of staging elements that need to go on, but they're going to venture out to almost 50,000 kilometers above the surface of the moon. So the apogee is around 50,000 kilometers. So that's a fair chunk of the way, 20% of or more of the way to the moon. So in that very large elliptical orbit that circles the Earth, they're going to be doing a number of tests. And then as they go around the Earth at point 10, they're going to go into TLI, translunar injection, and they're going to fire their rockets and then shut them down and coast, and then captured by lunar gravity. But the difference here is that they're going to do a flyby of the lunar surface. The closest they get is going to be about 4,000 nautical miles, or about 7,500 kilometers from the lunar surface. So it's really going to be a flyby, and they're going to be able to spend quite a bit of time looking at the dark side of the moon and doing some investigations there. And then on their way back, they'll do a free return trajectory back to Earth, and then re-enter Earth. And they're probably going to come back faster than any other manned space program has ever re-entered the Earth. And one thing of note here that discovered is that they're going to use what's called the skip return procedure, which sounds kind of sketchy, but actually makes sense because of the shape of the landing, the craft that's going to actually re-enter the atmosphere, and the heat shield, of which there's been a lot of discussion about. Some people claim that there's some issues there. Others claim that they have things well in hand, but they're going to use this skip return procedure to really knock the speed down because they're coming in so fast. They're going to use the initial skip to reduce this speed and then enter into a certain trajectory onto the surface. So it'll take longer to get through the atmosphere, but they'll have less, they'll need to dissipate less heat, and that should protect them more with the heat shield. It's a precautionary return procedure, and it's don't think it's ever been used. So that'll be interesting to see how that transpires. So mission status update. This is the, I think I did this one 8 times or something like that. It was a lot anyway. So recall on February 3rd, there were some tests done. They found a hydrogen fuel leak, which was actually not unexpected because that was something that was also a problem in Artemis 1. And if you know the makeup of hydrogen, it's a very difficult, in its liquid form, very hard to contain. So it's easy to have a hydrogen leak. There was also some issues with the pressure in the crew cabin compartment, wasn't stable, and some communication dropout issues, which sounds a bit ominous, but I think in the end they were resolved quite easily. Um, as a result of that, they pushed out some of the tests, and then attempted again on the 20th of February. They thought they corrected the hydrogen fuel leak, so they repressurized the tank, refueled it, and they completed the hydrogen fueling with no issues. But then during the early hours of the morning, the following morning, as they were releasing the pressure from the tanks and the hydrogen was being expelled, they discovered a helium interruption flow in the propulsion stage. And what that is it's important as hydrogen comes out of the tank. So so you pressurize the tank, the hydrogen is in there to its full capacity, and then you have to release it. There is, of course, empty space now in the pressure chamber. You have to fill that with helium. If you don't do that, you're going to be in trouble. There's going to be some pressure instabilities and bad things will happen, especially when you're in space. What they discovered is when they were trying to fill the thing with helium, they had leaks and it looked like it was in various components of the umbilical stage. And so unfortunately, they had to roll back Artemis 2 to the VAB, Vehicle Assembly Building. They subsequently repaired the umbilical seals, the chuck valves, and John sent out an email today, and it's been on the news as well, is it looks like they're confident that they've solved those problems and they're on track for an April launch. Fingers crossed. We'll see what happens because I really don't know how this is going to end up. They got to go through all these tests again, but there seems to be some high confidence. So let's keep our fingers crossed that this happens. The astronauts are scheduled to go into quarantine on March the 18th, so this coming week. So will be the third time. And I just put a quote there from Jen Lovell who said, space missions are not routine, and certainly they aren't. There's a lot of complexities here, and we got to keep that in mind that this is, last time they did this was a few years ago. They haven't had the experience of a regular cadence of launches and missions to gain experience with. So, things are likely to happen. Let's just hope they get off the ground this time. So let's compare this now to Apollo 8. When Apollo 8 went up in 1967, the end of 1967, we had the Saturn V, which was the complete assembly, and the next chart will show the differences between Artemis 2 rocket and the Saturn V rocket. But basically, it went up, and they went through the various staging, so 2 stages, and on the third stage, they lit their S4B, and that put them into translunar ejection. So fired that for a period of time, shut down, and then the moon would capture the ship. And then they did 10 orbits around the lunar surface down to about, I think, 175 kilometers. So they were pretty close to the lunar surface. And then on the 10th orbit, they lit their engines and fired it off and then returned back to Earth. And it was a highly successful mission. By and large, they had very few issues, but it gave them a lot of confidence towards the Apollo 9, 10, and 11. This mission did not land on the moon, which is similar to Artemis 2. It's just a flight around the moon, but they did orbit the moon, whereas Artemis 2 will be doing a flyby. So if you look at the two rockets, they almost look similar, but there are a few differences. Um, the Artemis, which is on well, let's cover the one on the right, which is Saturn, 363 feet tall, so 33 stories, which is taller than Artemis 2 at 322 feet. Um, it has, it's 6.2 million pounds of weight versus 5.5, so slightly heavier. Um, but the thrust of the engines, F1 engines, delivered 7.6 million pounds of thrust, which is quite phenomenal. Um, the SLS rocket, which is made up of four Rocketdyne engines and two solid fuel boosters, delivers 8.8 million pounds of thrust. So if you look at the power, the thrust to weight ratio, it's actually higher on the SLS rocket, slightly higher. Top speed. I mentioned before how the speed of the Artemis is going to be probably the fastest ever recorded when it enters Earth. The top speed of the Saturn V was around almost 18,000 miles per hour, 17.4 miles per hour versus 24.5. The command module, versus Orion. They were both commercially made. At that time, I think Lockheed Martin made the command module, and Orion is making the Jeff Bezos, and as Orion is making the capsules for the SLS rocket. Cost. So if you look in terms of today's dollars, the Saturn V was far more expensive than the Orion to build. And there's a lot of reasons for that. A lot of those costs were borne for the government because a lot of infrastructure was created by the government in order to put Apollo and the manned space program up in the air, versus on the SLS side, a lot of that is borne by the industry as well through contracts. However, and this is, I think, the last line there to me is a bit of a concern. If you look at the efficiency price tag, so I always look at this as the bottom line crunch, which is the Saturn V program was about 1.5, just under 1.5 billion in today's dollars, or 19 or 2022, maybe a little bit more now, versus 4.1 billion. That's a lot to be spending on every flight. I was hopeful looking through that they'd be able to reuse some of the space shuttle technology, and solid fuel boosters and other components could be reused, but apparently none of it's being reused. So possibility in the future that could come down, but change of administration, you never know what could happen to the program. So there's a bit of a concern that I have there with the cost efficiency per launch. So propulsion systems, looking at the Apollo propulsion system, and I mean, they had five F1 engines in the first stage, which were just a work of art. They're phenomenal pieces of technology, each producing 1.5 million pounds of thrust for a total of 7.6 million pounds of thrust, which is incredible to consider. They were very complicated. They had a complex start procedure. You have some of the ribbing you see on the outside of that engine there. Those are actually um, cooling pipes to cool the materials down. Otherwise, it would literally melt on the spot. So part of the complex starting procedure required liquid coolants to be going through at certain times. And then there was other problems that they encountered called pogo, which was a longitudinal vibration that would occur because of the way the fuel was presented to the engine and how it ignited. So they'd have to uh, alter some of the procedures, starting procedures, so that they'd eliminate some of that pogo effect. And also there was baffles that were created inside the chamber itself that helped to eliminate that. It was a big problem that they had to overcome, but through a lot of testing, that engine became extremely reliable. And apparently it was considered at one point for the Artemis program, but it was not used because Congress said they must try to reuse some of the space shuttle technology. So if you look at the Saturn vehicle, there was multiple components. There was the first stage, the S1C, which was the first stage, and it had five F1 engines, the ones I just talked about. And then they had a second stage, which had five J2 engines, a third stage, which is the S4B, which carried them into translunar injection. That had one or J2 engine, and then of course the spacecraft, which had the lunar module, the command and service modules tied to it as well. I won't go all through the various technology or technical parameters there, but you can read those. Quite a quite a rocket for its time for sure. The SLS is a bit different, obviously. Now, currently, it's still made by Boeing, and one can perhaps raise their eyebrows a bit because Boeing has been going through various challenges, and there's been a lot of discussions about for long term how Boeing's going to be involved in this program, given the issues they had with Starliner. But we will see. They have four RS-25 Aerojet Rocketdyne engines, which were used on the space shuttle program. So they're reusing some of that, and of course the solid fuel boosters. So they have ample thrust to get this thing, and they don't need all this thrust per se for the Artemis 2 program. However, in future missions, they'll be carrying more weight. There'll be other equipment. They want to be able to bring it up there. There's other complexities with future missions as well that require heavier lifting capability. Um, One thing that I mentioned before, and I'm kind of baffled as to why they're not doing this, is the reusability of some of this equipment. Quite frankly, I think given the fact that they were able to do some of that in the space shuttle program, and certainly with SpaceX, we ought to be looking at something like that. But currently, that's not on the cards, but maybe in future missions. The landers are, vastly different than what they had in the Apollo program. So if we start at the far right there with the LEM, Lunar Excursion Module, later called the LM, Lunar Module. Um, that thing was basically had a single purpose, was to bring two men down to the surface, stay for a period of time, and get off. And yes, it carried some scientific equipment and later on the lunar rover, but was really designed for very lightweight servicing and very different mission parameters than what you're going to see in the Artemis program. I'm going to move over to the far left now with the HLS. There's been a lot of talk about SpaceX's HLS, which is the lunar lander that is currently scheduled for I think Artemis 4 now. I say Artemis 3 here, but the mission has changed since I put this together. So, and I'll get that in a minute. But the whole idea of the HLS is to service a platform where you can bring up to a large amount of equipment. Um, so much equipment that you can start using it to assemble permanent bases on the moon. So I think 150 metric tons will be eventually carried on this particular lander. The project is delayed. Um, there have been several updates on it. They're getting closer, but I'm a little skeptical as to whether it'll be ready for 2028 now. It's slated for Artemis 4. It was originally thought for Artemis 3. So what they're going to do is for as a backup and also other missions as well. They have Origin Blue Moon, which will be used in Artemis Mission 5, which will be landing on the moon. Bigger than the lunar module for certain, but nowhere near as big as the HLS. However, it's considered potentially less risky at this stage. So they do have that in the mission program for the landing attempts, but it is not considered a vehicle whereby they can bring material to the surface that would allow them to construct a permanent station on the moon.
Dennis, a quick time check.
Yeah, okay. I'm almost done. Thank you. So future missions. So we have Artemis 3, which is now an Earth rendezvous mission. It was initially going to be a lunar landing mission. The lunar landing mission now is slated for Artemis 4 and 5, and they want to increase the cadence. So they may actually do two landings in 1 year, earliest is 2028. Um, Apollo achieved a lot of cadences, so they were launching two missions a year at least. They want to get to that type of cadence. They have to in order to get the experience and get to the future missions in a timely manner. If they wait too long in between missions, they just lose. We end up with the same situation we have with Artemis 1 and Artemis 2. Um, there are future considerations here for beyond, like Artemis 6, which is a lunar gateway, which will involve the European Space Agency Esprit and Canadarm, and it's to serve as a gateway for regular trips back and forth to the moon and to carry heavy equipment, and also serve as a platform for missions beyond. So, still not a lot of details on it. I do have a chart on that with some details, but I'll just glance over it. And then the idea is to get to Artemis 6 and beyond, which will have regular crewed landing missions. So getting to the moon with the HLS, this is to me a complexity which needs to be vetted and tested. So it's going to require up to 10 missions to provide enough fuel to cryogenic fuel for the HLS to get to the moon and then, do its mission and bring them back. It's a heavy beast. It's going to create a lot of equipment and needs a lot of fuel. So this is going to be a bit of a complex mission. They have to vet through all of this over the next little while, but SpaceX is kind of leading the charge with this part of the mission. This is the Lunar Gateway Space Station. Won't get into this as a whole presentation on itself. Maybe something we can consider in the future. But if you look at the complexities of putting permanent stations on the moon and regular trips to the moon, and then as a launch pad to, say, Mars, you're going to need something like this to house crews, get equipment, and do all kinds of things. So, and keep in mind too, is that the International Space Station is going to be decommissioned the next while. So they're going to need something else as well. And that's it, basically. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That was an amazing presentation, Dennis. Awesome. And you're getting a lot of applauses. I'm going to go to the questions. Can get to only a couple.
Yeah.
What from Beverly, what is the purpose of quarantine so they don't get sick before the launch?
Yeah. Ever since, the manned space missions, there's been a requirement to do some quarantining. The thinking there is if they're going to get sick, they don't want to get them sick in space. So, if you're going to catch the measles or the flu or something like that, given the astronauts a 2 week period, kind of goes through that whole process of making sure that they're not in contact with any foreign viruses or bacteria or anything like that. You recall on Apollo 13, that mission, that Ken Mattingly actually apparently was exposed to the measles. So the whole idea is that you quarantine the crew and you give them a better chance of not getting sick in space.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Kirby. Is it just the smaller rockets that are usable then?
So on the on the Artemis mission itself, um, there's nothing that's reusable, unfortunately. So even the smaller rockets are going to be used up, and that's why you have that $4.1 billion cost per mission. You basically have to rebuild them all, and I think they need to get away from that and make things that are reusable. SpaceX has proved that that's possible.
Thank you so much. There's one more question in the chat. Maybe you could just answer it after your talk, Dennis. There's a very quick question in there. Okay, thank you so
Thanks.
much. This was
Thank you.
amazing. And we'll go on to our next speaker, Kirby. And I hope I get this right. Le-Gentil, the unlucky astronomer. I'll let Kirby take this away. Thank you. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, good. All right, so yeah, Dennis, that was fantastic. I'm going to take us back a couple of centuries, so not near as modern day as your presentation. But I want to talk about this guy, Guillaume le-Gentil, and I kind of nicknamed him the unlucky astronomer, although that he's been called that over the last couple of centuries. He was a transit chaser astronomer back in the 1700s. And so we're going to talk about what that was all about and why he's called the unlucky astronomer. So we'll talk a little bit about the definition of a transit. And you can see the picture at the top of this agenda is a picture that I took. This is not a Venus transit. This is a Mercury transit. So I took that picture back in 2016 during that event. And you can see how tiny Mercury looks against the surface of the sun. I'll come back to that. There's an importance to that from a scientific perspective. But that's what a transit is. It's a smaller object passing in front of a larger object. And so we'll get into that. And then we'll talk about the frequency of transits for a slide or two and the scientific importance, just to kind of set up the scene about why all these astronomers in the 1700s and 1800s were traveling all over the world at great expense and peril and suffering to try to see these transits. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll get right into le-Gentil and the two transits that he was attempting to see in the 1700s. Okay, so here's the definition of a transit. As I mentioned a minute ago, a smaller body passing in front of a larger body. So from Earth, we can see transits of Mercury and Venus at certain times when they pass over the disk of the sun. And for us in the Northern Hemisphere, Venus enters at the left. That's called first contact, when it first makes contact with the solar disk. And then when it's fully on top of the solar disk, that's called second contact. And here it's labeled as interior contact, but also known as second contact. You can ignore the times. This is from one of the events earlier this century. And then much later, when it's about to exit, there's a third contact when it makes contact with the edge of the disk. And then there finally is a fourth contact when Venus has left the sun's surface altogether. So the frequency of Venus transits. So Mercury transits happen a little more frequently, but Venus transits are pretty interesting how they work. They happen in pairs, 8 years apart, and then each pair is separated by about 129.5 years or 113.5 years. Hopefully you can see my cursor moving around on the screen. And then those two time periods combine into the overall cycle of 243 years. So between between two pairs is 129.5 years, and then it's 113.5 years until the next two pairs. And that's the way these things play out. And so you can see them here listed, all the transits that have happened, not very many, generally a couple of century, given that kind of time frame. And so the scientific importance of Venus transits. At the time when the astronomers were chasing these transits all over the world, what they were trying to get a feel for was an accurate measure of the distance to the sun. And so we'll come to that in a minute. But why can you use a transit to do that? Well, if you can have two observers at very disparate locations, as far apart as you can get them, theoretically, on the Earth, and that separation on the Earth will cause those two observers to see the transit differently. The planet will enter at a different part of the disk. It'll enter on a different angle. It'll cross at a different angle, and you can get a feel for that from this simple diagram. And so if your two astronomers are at those two different locations, are measuring the times and the exact position of the planet on the disk of the sun, and measuring that and recording that as accurately as possible, both positioning and sun and times, then all of that data can be triangulated later, no pun intended, using parallax and trigonometry. You could get a distance to the sun. And so a little bit of history here. If we go back to when these things were first starting to be observed by humans, in the 17th century, astronomers knew the relative distances to planets, but they didn't know the absolute distances. So, for example, they knew that one planet was probably about twice as far away as this planet, and that planet is 3 times further away than this planet. So they had a sense of the relative scale and relative distances. What they didn't have was a common measuring stick that would allow them to say, right, if we know that distance, then we know how far away all these planets are. And so they really wanted to understand the distance from Earth to the sun, and they didn't know that number. And so Kepler back in, he predicted the Venus transit of 1631, but he died in 1630, so he never saw it himself. And that 1631 transit was clouded out across Europe, and that's where most professional astronomers in the world lived at that time. And so not very many people saw that transit. In 1639, Jeremiah Horrocks and William Crabtree were the first humans to look at a transit with some kind of optical aid. I think technically they used a projection method to kind of project the image of the transit onto a board, but they had optical aids to help them see it, and they were the first to do that. So that's the two that happened in the 1600s, 1631 and 1639. So now we advance a little bit, and Edmund Halley of Halley's Comet fame proposed that observations of a transit from two disparate locations on the Earth, like my drawing a couple slides ago, could be used to use trigonometry and measure the AU distance, the astronomical unit distance from the Earth to the sun. So he proposed that. He also suggested that it would likely work quite a bit better with a Venus transit than it would with a Mercury transit. And here's where my reference earlier on how small Mercury is against the surface of the Earth, or the sun's surface. If you're trying to measure the exact time when Venus or when Mercury enters the disk and measure those 4 contact points, it's going to be really, really hard because Mercury is so tiny. It's going to be really hard to measure those accurately. So he suggested Venus transits are likely going to be much more effective for this, and he was right about that. Now, he knew he wasn't going to see the next one. He died in 1742, but his parting words to his contemporaries were, hey, there's 2 coming up in 1761 and 1769. Take the opportunity to try this method out, because we should be able to get a feel for the distance to the sun. And it's these 2 transits that we'll be focusing most of this presentation on. They are the ones that le-Gentil was attempting to see. Now, all of this happened. There were a number of astronomers that did observe those 2 transits in the 1700s. And when they triangulated all the data and compared it all and averaged out and took away all the really bad outliers in the data, they got to a number of somewhere between 124 and 159 million kilometers for an AU. Now, that's quite a range. So clearly that's not a really accurate number. But they were starting to get into the ballpark, even in those 2 1700 transits. And now we fast forward a little bit to that was the 1761 transit. They got to that kind of a range. Now fast forward 8 years to the second one that le-Gentil was trying to see, the 1769 one. And there, they kept improving their techniques. They put more and more astronomers in the field at disparate locations, better data. They got it to 153 million kilometers. Now that's pretty good, actually. Because later transits in the 19th century, so the 2 in 1874 and 1882, of course, by then the equipment was getting better, the optical aids were getting better, the astronomers had more accurate techniques. So those ones got it down to 149.59 million kilometers. And today's spacecraft using telemetry have the distance at about 149.6. So they were they were getting extremely close. So even the early ones, they were in the ballpark. But certainly by the time they had exhausted the transits in the 1800s, they had pretty much nailed the number. So Halley was right. It can be done, and it was done. The astronomers did a pretty good job of executing despite all the challenges they faced at getting to different parts of the world in that time frame. So of course, today the transits are not that important. For that purpose, we know the distance to the AU using much different technology, more accurate technology. But they're probably used for other research initiatives, and they're still really cool, especially for us amateurs. So there were no Venus transits in the 20th century, and just because of the timing. So the pair that happened in our lifetime happened fairly recently, June 8, 2004, and June 6, 2012. And I am pretty safe at saying that nobody on the line in this meeting today is going to be around to see the next ones in 2117 and 2125. They're 90 plus years away. So Mercury transits are where you want to go if you want to see a transit. So just a couple of quick shots. This is one from the late Fred Espenac, Mr. Eclipse. And so this is a photo that he took of the transit of Venus in 2004. And you can see how much bigger Venus looks against the surface of the sun than my little Mercury dots on my agenda slide. And so Halley was right. These are the ones that you can use to try to get those measurements accurately. I missed that when I was living in Japan, and it poured all day long, so I was not able to see that transit. But 8 years later, I did see the second one in 2012. And there's a whole story around this, which I've shared with the club in the past. But these are my kind of rough pictures at the bottom, just showing the progression towards third and starting to progress towards fourth contact at the end of the transit. And just the one thing I want to point out, I was observing this from the west coast of the Red Sea and watching the sun rose over the Red Sea with Venus already on it. So I missed first and second contact from that location, but I had 100% chance of clear skies in the desert there in the Red Sea. So that's why I chose that location, and I got to see most of the transit and certainly third and fourth contacts. But the key takeaway on this slide is in red in the bottom left corner. Notice that those two photos were taken about 15 minutes apart or so, and you can see that Venus has moved maybe about a Venus diameter in a 15-minute time period. So that gives you a feel for, how long it takes to cross, but we'll come back to that point in a minute. Okay, so now let's get into le-Gentil. And as I go through these slides, there's a lot of words on these slides. Don't trouble yourself trying to read the slides. They're there for me to kind of get the full story. I did look for images, I looked for photos, but we are talking about the 1700s. So there's not a plethora of relevant photos. He wasn't taking pictures with his phone every 5 minutes that I could flash up and make the slides a little more interesting. So don't worry about all the words that are on these slides. Just listen to me and then perk up a little bit when you see a graphic. But there's his full name at the top: Guillaume Joseph Hyacinthe Jean Baptiste le-Gentil de la Gasparotto. I'm pretty sure I butchered that. And there are certain elements, I think in those days, certain elements of a long name like that referred to locations or sourcing of where you came from and family history and everything else. So, but I've got to get some more. I got to get me some more names for sure. But he was born in 1725 in Normandy, and he originally, as a young man, pursued an ecclesiastical career, but soon became very interested in science and turned his attention towards science. He was clearly an achiever. He worked at the Royal Observatory in Paris. He was elected to the French Academy of Sciences in his 20s. So he was a mover and a shaker. So now the 1761's appearing or approaching. le-Gentil had actually witnessed a Mercury transit in 1753. And that was interesting to him. It got him really excited about the Venus transits. But he knew that the Venus transits would be much more effective from a scientific perspective. So he started a plan. So he proposed to the Academy that he go to Pondicherry, India, and swap. Now, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correct or not, but Pondicherry, India, where the 1761 transit would be visible, and that was approved He was approved to make that trip and be in position with his equipment at that location. And of course, the Academy and the Royal Astronomy organizations in the UK were all planning trips around the globe for various astronomers for these two transits. So he left on March 26, 1760, on a French India Company ship, heading over there. Now, the first real struggle he had was that he was traveling on the seas during the 7 Years' War. And this war was primarily between England and France, although both those countries had some allies within Europe. So it really had become quite a regional war with a number of countries involved. The oceans were very dangerous. And in fact, English and French ships were obligated by their governments to attack each other if they saw each other on the high seas. So the two academies working on preparing for this transit, the Royal Society in England and the academy that le-Gentil came from in France, they were working together. They had a great working relationship. They were planning transit measurements together and kind of coordinating where they would be sending their astronomers. But against the backdrop of war, their governments didn't particularly care about supporting their efforts. So it was a very difficult time to be moving around on the seas. And so in March 1760, the ship that he was on actually had to evade some British ships to avoid getting blown out of the water. But he was around that time, he was able to observe a lunar eclipse from the ship. And then later the ship was pursued by 5 more British warships. So a very eventful trip, you might say. After about 6 seasick weeks, he arrived in Mauritius Island. And this was a French territory. And so it was on the French trade route to India. It had a naval base. They were building ships there. Very important to the French in the 7 Years' War in terms of outfitting warships and restocking warships and using that location to launch attacks on English territories. So his plan was to get off at Mauritius and then catch a ship from there to Pondicherry in India and watch from there. So he got off his first ship on July 11th, 1760 in Mauritius. 2 days later, a vessel arrives from India with some bad news. The English had taken some key ports along that coast of India. And in fact, the English had blockaded Pondicherry itself. So Pondicherry was under siege by English warships. He would have to wait. So the next few months on Mauritius were pretty uncomfortable for everybody that was there. Supply ships were scarce. They couldn't come through because of the blockades. Prices went up, but he waited. While he was waiting, he started to think about alternative plans. So he said, well, maybe I'll go to this little tiny island of Rodrigues, which I think is further east, not crazy far away from Mauritius, but further east into the Indian Ocean. About 600 kilometers away from Mauritius. Very tiny island. I think if the internet's correct, this is a picture of that island, very tiny. And he thought, well, maybe I'll go there and I'll watch it there because it doesn't look like Pondicherry is going to work out. But that wasn't really favored by the Academy, because what he wasn't aware of is that another astronomer named Pingre was being dispatched to Rodrigues on that little island. And recall that the goal here is to get our astronomers as far apart as they can as they take their measurements. So having 2 astronomers on this little tiny island in the middle of the Indian Ocean was not really going to help solve the issue. They need astronomers to be at disparate locations. So that wasn't really going to work very well. So by November 16, le-Gentil was still on Mauritius, suffering from dysentery now. But the French eventually sent a ship to Mauritius with orders to resupply the besieged Pondicherry. So he thought, okay, this is my chance. So he hopped on that ship on March 11, 1761, hoping to get to Pondicherry in time for the transit. So this is March 11th. The transit's coming up in June 1761. So he's only got about 3 months to spare. So the ship he was on was unable to land in India. It got close, but the seas were still very dangerous, still very much in wartime. All those coastal ports were still blockaded, so they were unable to do that. And so essentially the ship turned around and started to head back for Mauritius. And the ship was still at sea on transit day on June 6, 1761. So le-Gentil actually was one of the first of all the transit chasers all over the world. He was one of the first to see Venus on the sun, but he did it from the deck of a pitching ship. And it's even on today's luxury cruise ships that are huge and don't move an enormous amount. Very difficult to point a telescope at something and keep it on target, right? Because the ship's moving. And in those days, much smaller wooden ships in the age of sail, pitching all over the place, right? So he did his best. He attached his telescope to a wooden beam that was attached to the ship's mast. And he could occasionally catch a glimpse, but of course, every time the ship bobbed, he lost the sun. And then he had another problem because he's on a ship. He can't do the timekeeping accurately. This is 1761. And so many of you will know about historical John Harrison. He's the guy that invented the chronometer. And the chronometer is just a fancy word for a clock that works on a ship. Up until that point, no clocks worked. They all had pendulums, and pendulums don't work on a pitching ship. So up until that was a huge problem for seagoing ships, is knowing exactly the time, because without knowing exactly the time, it was very difficult to get longitude. And so that problem was eventually solved by John Harrison when he invented the chronometer. That would have helped enormously, but John was just finishing that invention at the time that le-Gentil was pitching on his ship trying to look at the transit. So he didn't have a chronometer with him, so he couldn't do the times very well. He missed contacts 1 and 2 because of cloud, but he did catch third contact and fourth contact. And so his method of timing was he had a sailor turning a 30-second hourglass. And so when he judged that third contact had happened, he said, right, okay, start turning the hourglass. So the guy turned the hourglass 28 times before le-Gentil concluded that fourth contact had happened and Venus was off the surface of the sun. So that 30 seconds, 28 times, roughly 15 minutes. And that's why the reference that I made earlier in the presentation, when you could see from my photos that Venus moves about a diameter in 15 minutes. And so he was seeing roughly the same time frame, but with a very inaccurate timekeeping method. So in orange here, he had seen the transit, but he knew his measurements would be useless for science. And so he was pretty devastated not to have been able to collect the data that he had spent several years trying to get in position to do. He'd been the first to leave Europe. He traveled thousands of miles. He went through hurricanes, bad weather, survived disease, deprivation, and achieved virtually nothing of scientific value. And that's a quote from one of the books that I referenced for this. So a few days later, the ship made a stop at that little tiny island of Rodriguez that he had considered going to. But le-Gentil was so depressed that he was just staying in his cabin and not talking to anybody. So he did not get off the ship. It turns out that other astronomer, Pingré, was sent to Rodriguez, and he did go to Rodriguez, but he was clouded out, so he was also unsuccessful. And so at the very least, if he had gotten off the boat, he probably would have met Pingré, and at least they could have cried over a couple of beers and commiserated a little bit, because they were both unsuccessful on the transit. Okay, there's the first one. So now let's go and see what happens with the 1769 transit. So eventually the ship gets back to Mauritius and le-Gentil starts to regain his optimism. Another opportunity was only 8 years away. So he was not going to miss it. And so rather than return to France, he didn't have a wife. He didn't leave a wife and children back in France. So rather than return to France, he decided, I'm just going to hang around and I'm going to wait for the next one. It's only 8 years away. Now that sounds crazy to us, but we have to remember that we live in a world where we can get on a plane and we can be on the other side of the planet in 13 hours. He lived in a world where a trip back to France was full of risk. Hurricanes, wars, just ships crashing, full of risk. So what he proposed to the academy was that they continue to pay him, And he would work on some natural science data collection. He would work on more precise charts of the islands to the east of the African coast. So Mauritius is over by Madagascar on the east coast of Africa. And he had noticed from all of his ships, all the ships he had been on in the Indian Ocean, that the captains and the navigators really didn't have very good maps of the eastern coast of Africa and the islands along there. So he did a lot of mapping for the next several years and greatly improved the maps that were available at that point. So by 1765, he had selected Manila. So he said, I'm going to go to the Philippines. I think that's going to be a great site to watch the next transit. And so on May 1st, 1766, this is now years before, this is 3 years before the next transit, he leaves. He's going to be there on time. He's going to be there early. So he departed Mauritius, bound for Manila, with 3 years to spare. Well, okay, so now he gets almost shipwrecked in a horrendous storm, but they pull through that and he survives it. So I guess he's either unlucky for all the things that keep happening to him, or he's lucky that he keeps surviving all the things that keep happening to him. But he got there, started to kind of get set up in Manila. Then he receives a letter from Paris telling him that other astronomer, Pingré, he was going to be involved again in the 69 transit. And he was in a position of authority there now. And he decided that Manila was not a great place for him to be. That's not ideal in collecting the data for the Venus transits. So le-Gentil was directed to go to, wait for it, Pondicherry, India. So they tell him he should go to the place that he spent 2 years trying to get to for the first transit unsuccessfully. So he kind of rationalized in his mind, maybe this is a good thing. He had noticed there was a lot of cloud in the summer months in Manila during his time there. So he thought, well, maybe this is Providence. Maybe I'll be cloud out anyway if I stay in Manila based on the summer that I've seen this year. So he gets on he goes out on July 3rd, 1769. And by mid-February, he was headed for India. Okay. So now the ship once again encounters violent storms as it enters the Indian Ocean, and once again was in danger of shipwreck. And this is great. The captain and the first officer, in the middle of this huge storm, they start fighting with each other and arguing about what to do. They both storm off in a huff and to their cabins, which is a really mature and practical thing to do when the ship's in trouble. So le-Gentil actually had to grab the steering wheel of the ship, the tiller of the ship, and guide it to safety. So at least his years on ships in bad weather were paying off to a degree with these dysfunctional officers on the ship. But on March 1768, 8 years after landing in France, he sighted Pondicherry for the first time. And this time it was not in a war zone. It's back to being French territory. So le-Gentil immediately went, met with the French governor, started to work on the observatory with the chief engineer. And within 2 months, they were building, laying bricks and getting it ready. So the observatory they built for him had a large room about 15 by 15 feet with large 9-foot high windows for him to do his observing out of. And this is interesting, the fact that it was built in one of the old forts at Pondicherry, and that it was built on top of a vault that held 60,000 pounds of gunpowder. Now, for a guy that's this unlucky, it's amazing that didn't bother him, but that's where they built it, right on top of 60,000 pounds of gunpowder. What could possibly go wrong for le-Gentil? But fortunately, nothing ever blew up. The war was over. And the English were actually very helpful. They sent him a new achromatic telescope to use as part of his observing. And so he observed a lunar eclipse there, which was important to really pin down his exact latitude. So now he knew exactly where he was on the planet, and that's very important in the data collection. Here's a little picture I found. It's an etching of the fort, and the arrow is pointing to the observatory that was built for him on top of the gunpowder storage room. Okay, we're almost done here. So now everything's ready. By the time transit day comes around, le-Gentil had been preparing in Pondicherry for more than a year. And just to give you a sense of how many missions were being sent out, the British had more than 80 observers on 30 stations in Britain and 16 abroad. The French had about 50 astronomers at 18 locations in France and 5 abroad. So it's a big deal in the astronomy community. The sun would rise with Venus already on it. but le-Gentil would be able to observe and measure third and fourth contacts accurately. The weather in Pondicherry had been perfect for more than a month, totally clear for more than a month before the transit. He wakes up at 2 a.m. on day of transit, looks out, and it's overcast skies with no wind whatsoever. Later, it didn't improve. The wind picked up, but in a bad way. There were squalls later on. By 7 a.m., the transit was over, and he had missed the whole thing. And by 7:30, the skies had completely cleared. Poor guy, poor guy. So he could do nothing for 2 weeks after the transit. He was so devastated. And then it didn't help when he learned later that over in Manila, where he was originally gonna set up to watch the transit, the skies were perfectly clear. And had he stayed in Manila, he would have been able to execute the transit. So that was a cruel irony for him. So now we'd have to return to Paris empty-handed. Then he got a letter from France because he had been away for at that point about 9 years. Somebody had declared him dead. His estate had been robbed, and heirs were starting to plan to divide up the rest of his fortune, or whatever assets he had. So bad news from France. He departed Pondicherry finally in March 1st, 1770, and 6 weeks later got back to Mauritius to collect all his natural history stuff and his naval maps that he'd been making. He'd been struggling with illness. He was not strong enough to continue on from Mauritius for 7 months. So it took 7 months to get healthier. When he did get on a ship, a hurricane forced the ship back to Mauritius again. And by this point, he couldn't stand even the sight of that island. On March 30th, 71, almost 2 years after the 69 transit, he finally boarded a ship again for Europe. This time there was another violent storm as it rounded the Cape of Good Hope. But it did make it to Spain. It landed in Cadiz, Spain, in August 1st, 1771. And at that point, he said, you know what? I'm done with ships. So he went overland the rest of the way to Normandy, which probably wasn't easy in those days either, but he couldn't get himself on another ship. So le-Gentil was the last of the transit astronomers to get back to Europe, more than 11 years after he had left for the first one. So my last slide here paints a happier picture for him later in life after all these massive disappointments with the 2 transits. He was about 46 years old when he got back to France. He was gone for 11 years, 6 months, and 13 days. He had traveled 30,000 miles. He succeeded in reclaiming his estate. He sorted out his heirs, told them to go away, and he renewed his academy membership quite quickly. Then he married a wealthy heiress, Mademoiselle Poitiers, and they had a daughter, and they all lived together at the Paris Observatory where he worked. So a happy life there. He died in 1792 at the age of 67. Now, this was in October. The revolution in France is underway. And if you've ever read any books about the horrors of the terror, what happened to people in the ruling and bourgeoisie class was unbelievably brutal. So he had married into that class, right? So he was fortunate in the sense that the worst of the terror happened a few months after he passed away. So hopefully he was able to avoid something really bad there. So maybe he had a little bit of luck at the end. I think the last bullet point, as I read all this stuff, I think the thing that strikes me about him is that his transits were fraught with hardship, obviously extreme disappointment, but he always managed to bounce back, usually after a short period of depression. But he always found a way to bounce back, get optimistic again, and start making some new contributions to science. And one of those contributions was a 2-volume book that he wrote. This is the front cover of that book. Covers the entire 11-year period, wide-ranging on natural science, astronomy, the transits, navigation of ships, all that stuff. A lot of different topics covered, really good contribution to science. And if any of this interests you to read more about it, you can take a picture of this screen. I'll leave this one up for a minute. But these are the main sources I used for this story. Some really great books on all the adventures that astronomers met with all around the world as they chased the 17th and 18th century transits. So let me pause there and see if there's any questions.
Amazing story, Kirby. I was engaged to the entire presentation. Well done. And clearly, lots of research that went in. You can see a lot of emojis coming, scrolling through the screen for you. Okay, let me see if there's any questions. There is not, but there are a couple comments. Excellent presentation. Well done. I am sad to have missed the Venus transit in my lifetime and mind blowing. Very good. So if folks think of a question, definitely post it in the chat. So with Ron, he's going to give us some information on astronomy clubs in schools. So looking forward to your talk, Ron. Thank you.
Astronomy is such a fascinating topic because you have so many aspects like space missions, history that we've heard about, special events like transits, of which I've seen 2 of Venus. I was very lucky. And wonderful topics of, like, are we alone? There's just so much to astronomy. Anyway, I've been working hard on astronomy school clubs, and this is a talk within a talk. I'm going to show part of a talk I've given to educators to encourage them to consider helping with a school club. Then I'm going to talk about how we can help them. So here we go. I took this picture in the at the left from ground level at Starfest of people looking up with the sky out, being at a star party. They're wonderful conversations. You hear about the latest discoveries, and when it's clear, there's wonderful observing through monster telescopes. Just great time. Anyway, so I ask ways to get youth excited about science, and a big way is dinosaurs and astronomy. And again, this is part for teachers. How do you stimulate youth interest? Great teaching. I know a lot of adults who are inspired by one teacher at some time in their life, and extracurriculars such as sports teams or school astronomy clubs. I spent a lot of time researching, and I've talked to a lot of people. I've scoured the internet. I've recorded ideas. And you wonder what the yellow dots are? Those are places where I've been in contact with different people. I recorded the information on a spreadsheet where I wrote down URLs. I made a brief description of what each idea was about. Sometimes I wrote my own idea, and I've gone from row 6 to row 183, so there are almost 200 ideas. Unfortunately, I went through it a few months ago and had to delete a lot of ideas that are websites that don't work anymore, including a number of NASA. Every idea I rated by level, and I want to add university, post-secondary as an additional one, and they're different categories. And I made these are clickable descriptions. So if you see this spreadsheet, you can just click one. But I also made a website, and when the RESC was changing their website from Drupal to WordPress, I figured that's going to be a long time to wait, so I just did it, and I'm glad. Now, I made a bunch of business cards, and I was going to hand them out to everybody in person, but obviously I can't. So if you could just write down astroschoolclub.ca, and I'll also post it to everybody. And that's a website that I personally started, and here we go. It's easy to use. There's a blue button now. It's just elementary and secondary at the bottom. And if you click elementary, you get a list of the 8 categories, and I'll go through them all. And when you click one of the categories, you get a list of, I think it's about 24 ideas. I only show the top. And I'm going to show the one about rocket launches. And Matteo, there's your picture. This was at the Toronto picnic they have. Yes, I see that, Matteo. I wanted to write it because I started out talking about safety procedures, and I wanted multiple links. Sometimes it's just straight to a link. If instead you click secondary inactivities, you get a different list of activities. Some are both in like the rocket launches in both. And I'm going to this one that is Galaxy Sort. And this is a link to something that I haven't written. It's just straight from some group has made it and it's being posted. I think it's about 20 years old, but most of the information is still the same. Groups get 20 galaxy images. All right. Then they cut them out and they sort and they make a classification system. Then they talk to the others about why they organized it this way. And then you compare it to the accepted scheme. And Edwin Hubble made this about a century ago, and it's more or less the same. The Milky Way used to be up here, and now it's considered a barred spiral. And this is for teachers. And I then give a great big message of get help, because it's a lot of work to print these things out, to have them ready. And in a club, it's often easy to get parents. Unfortunately, in my school, most parents had to work 2 jobs, like it was difficult for them. But for a lot of schools, you can get a parent or somebody to help with all the running around that has to be done to run a really rich program. Under the category of project, there are a whole bunch of them, and I'm only going to talk about Galaxy Zoo. This is one of the citizen science projects, and there's some more that the Education Public Outreach Committee has made that hopefully I'll get into a new version of this. And what you do is you log in and you're taught to sort galaxies using roughly that system. Then you look at galaxies that have recently been imaged, and probably maybe 1 or 2 other people have even seen them, and you're going to classify them. And that provides information to help scientists that want to research a certain type of galaxy, say that's 2 billion years old and 10 billion years old, how the shapes have changed. And this is the way science progresses. So that's an aspect of this that you can get to. Demonstrations. There are lots of demonstrations that are fun, but they take a lot of work to set up. And there's one on making craters. And to be honest, in one class, I used to teach high school, I dropped rocks into flour, and kids had fun, and they kept dropping and dropping and dropping and making a big mess that the caretakers didn't like. But it just didn't seem that much to me. But Paul Heath in Halifax Center came up with a better method, and he talked about it. You can actually see rays. This is the crater Copernicus taken from Earth, and these are rays. And also you can see at the bottom, there's central mountains from the same crater taken from an Apollo astronaut. He uses mixture of flour and baking soda. And if you can see the screen with my image, this is a sifter, and you sift rather than pour the mixture into a plastic pan, and it gives it the right strength. Then you sift a layer of darker chocolate on top, and then you drop not rocks that are high density, but low density nuts and tweezers to remove impactors, because once you drop one, everybody wants to drop 10 or more, make 10 or more craters. So it's good fun. Notice that in this is actually a picture of the flour mixture. You can see some rays, and there's evidence of mountains in the middle. So it's great. Lessons are the easiest things for leaders to run. If you click Galaxy of Black Holes, you've got a PowerPoint right there. They give you a script to read if you want to do that. And this one's about falling into a black hole. And it's kind of neat because the gravity's stronger at the front than the back. So you get stretched. And I wonder if Anna, who I hope is still here, I gather you're in grade 9. Oh, good. I don't know if you know what it's called, but they use great big Greek words, and it's called spaghettification because the astronaut stretched as well. There are a number of websites that have multiple ideas, 10 or 20 ideas. To me, when I talk about here's how you build a comet, you can go straight to it. You can get ideas to how to develop it to the Oort cloud or whatever. But these take more time because you got to go through them. So if you click elementary and the early learner ideas in the Astronomy Society of the Pacific, it's sort of like an American version of the RASC, slightly different, based in San Francisco. Anyway, they have a whole bunch of ideas like here's something with shadows and kids make space helmets out of plastic bags. UV sensitive beads. I've never used them, but they're mentioned several times and look like quite positive for activities. And you can make a big print of the moon and then tape on different images like a hammer or whatever that an astronaut could have dropped. And then the kids sketch that. Now, this is for elementary level, but it could be really engaging. Stellarium, observing. There are a whole bunch of ideas in observing. I'm just going to talk about Stellarium. It's a free app. I made screen save from my cell phone and whatever, and the yellow is mine. I'm just going the upper right is searching. And if you browse by type, you get a list of comets. And then when you click a particular comet like Macnaughton, you get the stars where the comet is. But in my experience, comets, when they're closest and brightest, are near the sun, so they're still part of the glow. So the stars are useless to me. But if you have it in your cell phone and if you see the image of me and you hold the cell phone over your head with this program going, it goes into compass mode. And you see this little arrow that shows how you move it to point to where it is in the sky. So it's easy to find comets. There are other ways as well. Also in observing, Emile Cormier in the New Brunswick Center, to me, has made a brilliant thing on buying telescopes, going through the different types with different features. And actually, he added another page when I asked him to the uh, the New Brunswick Center to put it back on their website. And I really encourage you to go to the Astro School Club clubsingular.ca and you can look at it. And photo processing. And here you have two smudgy images. When you combine a bunch together, you get a beautiful picture. And I know one guy who led a club and he took them to a community college photo lab and the programs were all loaded. I don't know how he arranged that. And they made these photos. They combined them together. Each kid got the print that they had processed and they took it home to show their friends and family. Really neat. Club Run is a whole bunch of ideas on running clubs, and there are a lot of ideas. Starting ideas of starting a club, fundraising, promotion, and it's really great to link with the local astronomy club. My last idea is general thoughts, and some of these are heavy duty, serious discussion about how important a school astronomy club is. But I just want to talk about a school club discussion in the Cloudy Nights Forum. And I've typed out a small bit of it from here, and a guy is talking about doing it, and he's asking for advice. And I was all excited in my research. This person's going to say, well, in my club, we did this, and the kids loved it, and that sort of idea. But he got relatively little. But what he did get is a lot of comments from people that were part of school clubs. And one guy talked about people in the club when he was there that had senior roles with the Hubble shuttle simulators to train astronauts, underwater photography, computers. And it was basically a wonderful experience. Now, I'm trying to sell to teachers that running an astronomy club would be a wonderful experience. It's fun. They learn about space. It's good for the teaching career. I've read 180 resumes and I look for certain special things. Like one guy talked about making potato cannons. I called to make an appointment for an interview, and I took his wife took him out of the shower to take that. And he did a brilliant job, just a brilliant teacher. It's good to have something special for a resume. It gives opportunities for students. Imagine going into, as a 15-year-old, to a group of adults in a service club and say, can you give us $500 to buy a telescope? And if you do it well and have a proper business plan, you might be lucky. And last, some young people get inspired by being part of a club. Now, that's it for what I told the teachers. Now I want to talk about how we as the RASC can help with astronomy clubs. I also found a British version of this, but it had a grammatical error, which I couldn't believe. Anyway, I ask everybody, please visit Astro School Club, Club Singular.ca. And I can't give you cards because we don't have a meeting. That helps the search engine ranking. But I ask you not just to go to it and then leave. I've cut out a whole bunch of stuff that I originally wrote on it. It's almost 200 ideas. And to play with a little bit, like click either elementary, secondary, look at some of the categories, maybe visit two or three. I'd really appreciate that because you could get an idea how it works. I'd love help as part of an Astro Club's team. Um, I'd love to have more ideas that post-secondary clubs use. So far, it's just secondary and elementary. And somebody could do that research, contact the different clubs, have conversations with wonderful people that lead clubs. I like more projects, writing content, ideas for promoting. So I'd love it if somebody could help. I'm not that skilled with computers. And right now, the updating is a complex process. I have the monster file with going up to 183, row 183. I've got to sort it several times. I get 16 different files that are all separately labeled. Then each of them I have to edit, add some pictures. Then I save it as a spreadsheet. Yeah. Then I have to save it as a PDF, and that it's just a big process. That's not something that can be easily done. Format could be a lot better, and I would love to see it better. I've just been struggling how to do it, but it has to be in a way that it's simple, clickable, and it works well with cell phones. How could RESC centers help? Well, I was going to show you, I don't know if you can see my image on the screen, but this is a piece of paper I printed on two sides, and you just fold it and rip it apart, and you can make individual cards, two-sided, and it's a little over 5 cents a copy, not counting tax, but if the RESC buys something, they get the tax back. Anyway, if centers could promote activities like this at outreach events, maybe some more people will be interested. Also, if a club starts, like Anna, I don't know whether you're planning to encourage a club or you're part of one, get in touch with the center. And I'd love it if somebody would be willing to maybe be the point person for school clubs if somebody contacts, give them advice. I've been to many schools with a star party, and maybe three or four of us bring our telescopes, set them up. They see planets, the moon, whatever. Principal is just glowing to have such a positive event. Sometimes as a teacher, even though I've had astronomy as a hobby for most of my life, I got stumped with a question. Kids are great at that. And what I would sometimes do is I would post it to an email group of astronomers. And once a kid asked a question, I think it was about galaxies. And the next day I was able to say a professor in BC gave the answer, and I summarized the answer for him, and then I posted it on the wall and he could read all the detail. And that student was just beaming to think that he was part of that. So it's really worthwhile. RESC National. Still things are being worked out. I would be happy if eventually it becomes part of the RESC, among other things. I'd like to have it be run after I can't manage it anymore. My format isn't very good, and there are all sorts of copyright issues, and I've got to be more careful about it, and a lot of things still to resolve. One of the student leaders I talked to said a starter package would be wonderful. So I paid $18 to buy this box that is mailable. Like you put an address on it, give it to the post office, they'll deliver it anywhere in Canada. I suggested various things like the Galaxy Sort activity and other printouts to encourage students or clubs to do that sort of thing. And I even included a roll of tape for adding machines. And you give everybody a meter of tape and you say, okay, put the sun at one end draw Neptune at the other, and then draw the other planets. And my guess, even the most experienced amateurs here would not get the spacing right and put the inner planets too far apart because we're really close together here and the other planets are really spaced out. Maybe starfinders as well. Um, could the RESC promote it? I played with the idea of a brochure. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I played with it. And of course, are the cards. Here's where the RESC would be especially useful because if I call a science center and ask them to distribute these, they're probably going to say, well, who are you? But if I say I'm from the RESC and could you distribute them, they probably would. And I think telescope stores would want them because it will encourage more interest in astronomy and maybe eventually sell telescopes. So I think we could reach a lot of people with doing that if we could do it. And I don't think I'm going to say anything on the last slide. Thank you, everybody, and I hope there's some questions that I'd be happy to answer.
Amazing presentation. I think all three of our speakers today hit it out of the park. So thank you so much, Ron. Very informative, and you can see the emojis going across the screen.
Oh, wonderful.
There are, if there are any questions for Ron, please post them. I think they were asked of the website. That's been done already. While waiting for questions to pop up, Robin actually had could Robin take a minute just to talk about the youth group? Anna asks, can we get in touch with Mr. Macnaughton? And Ron, if you're comfortable posting your email
Oh,
on,
okay.
or I can do it.
Um,
Yeah.
Anna, if I mean, I'll also give you my personal email if you want. But if you go to the website astroschoolclub.ca, it gives a email address that comes through to me. And if that doesn't work for some reason, and like I say, I'm not the greatest at computers, I'm happy to contact somebody here, and I'll give you my email. Is that okay with you?
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay,
Okay.
wonderful. I'm so happy, and a number of clubs have been started by students. And there's one guy who went to his principal and said, "I want to start a club," and the principal said, "You need an advisor and 10 students." And he came back a week later and he said, "I have two teachers who will be advisor, and I have 30 students interested." So that's quite a dynamic young man who's now at university, but it was quite a club.
Hey, Ron, why don't
Yeah.
you post astroschoolclub.ca to our website, to our groups IO, to main groups IO.
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah, I'll
Yeah,
do that.
definitely you should do that.
Yeah.
Because virtually every member we have is on that. That's all.
Yeah. Uh, but it's basically just a source of ideas. And every, leader of the club has to look at it and say, this sounds good, this doesn't sound good. And especially if you get help with production of, printing things out, and maybe a parent has a job where they can, spend some time doing it, whatever, it just makes it so much better because it's a lot of work to run a rich program.
Oh, for sure. There are compliments on the chat for you, Ron, so you may want to just go through them. In the meantime, if you can stop sharing, we will
Oh,
go to announcements.
okay. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. So we are looking for Potpourri volunteers. You saw three amazing speakers today for our April Potpourri.